Yep, testing 1, 2. That looks good.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate the help.
Oh, we'll grab my glasses.
This plug.
Hi. Matt, I'm Jeffrey. Jeffrey Holmes. Maybe. No. At Brentwood? Oh, okay. Well, I've been here pretty much the whole time. Jeff and Matt. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm Jeff. Nice meeting you, Barbara. Vicki. And Reed. I always think of that. Yes, it does. It certainly does.
And if you said Rio Rita, I'd go really old.
Yeah, yeah. Lovely Rita. That's good. And when I'm 64.
Okay, so I guess it's about time. Thanks for everybody for coming. There's probably going to be some stragglers coming in, I would imagine. So I kind of planned for that in the sense that the beginning will be kind of an introduction, a little Q&A, just to clarify everything, and we'll go through a little mindfulness practice beforehand as well. And then we'll get into the posters. So the details about the posters a little bit after some experiential things. And are there any questions before we get started?
Oh, we have lots of questions.
Okay.
I'm sure you're going to answer them on the way.
Okay, so you've responded to a unified theory of time, consciousness, and quantum mechanics. Does anybody here have any practical practical experience with the study of quantum mechanics or physics? Perfect. So that's great. It's really great because, and this is the reason is, and I think I have this as one of the quotes, and it's in my background. I joined the Navy out of high school. Actually, I brought a couple of documents. One of them right there, the big thick one, that's my bachelor's degree. If anybody has any, there's stuff in there about my background. You're welcome to look through there. But I graduated from St. Mary's College while I was on active duty with the business degree, and then went on to work in the semiconductor industry, and from there went into the arts. And although I didn't know it at the time, the Navy actually taught us consciousness theory, and they called it team leadership. But a lot of the stuff that they taught us was non-deterministic, sort of what we would consider new thought concepts. Yeah, in a military environment. And after my sea duty, I served here at NAS Alameda as a training specialist. And so there, I'm going to turn this down a little bit.
What were you training?
The command I was at was a training command and a maintenance command. So we had, whenever a fleet would come in, there'd be tons of training to conduct. And I was one of the administrators. And then, so we ran a school. And there was a constant influx of people. And then I was also an instructor. And what I got certified in was total quality management instruction. So in the civilian world, that's often called Six Sigma. There's lots of different words for it. Productivity, basically continuous process improvement. But there was a lot of practical, what might be considered practical statistics and methodologies like that. But then there was also the leadership component, which was largely based on the works of W. Edwards Deming and Eastern philosophy. So what the Navy certified me in was a management philosophy that blended Western methodology and Eastern philosophy. And the Eastern philosophy part was the part that came about team building, and that's where we really started looking at consciousness. And like I said, I didn't know it then. I was not a spiritual practitioner at the time, and was just interested in the science part of it. But there was a phenomena that I found really compelling, and it was illustrated in a book called Out of the Crisis that W. Edwards Deming wrote. And if you're not familiar with him, I didn't know about him until till I got certified in his work, but Deming, W. Edwards Deming. So he, to this day, is considered one of the most influential foreigners in the history of Japan. And he was part of the team that was sent to Japan after World War II to help rebuild it. And so he was there as both a facilitator of industry and a student of Eastern philosophy. And in this book, it illustrated one of the case studies that they marked was there was a transmission plant that was built in Japan that was identical to one built in Detroit. Completely the same, down to the nuts. You couldn't tell the difference if you took a camera through them, right? And then after they were both up and running, the Japanese plant far exceeded the Detroit plant in every capacity. You know, less turnover, higher profit, less failure rate. The products were better, the people were happier, everything was better, but they were both held to the same standards. And when a deep study, when they went in and looked at it, they looked at the American teams were mostly specialized and they did their own little part and it was very assembly line, whereas the Japanese, naturally it was part of their culture to cross-train and learn what everybody else was doing, so they had a better understanding of the whole process. And so one of the lessons they learned from that was that, you know, just if you're in a system that people are in, the better the people understand the system, the more it will self-optimize. So there were things happening, and this was the mysterious part, where there were things happening that people thought were awesome, but nobody was specifically planning to do. And that was part of the consciousness theory. That's what really sparked my interest in learning how that phenomena actually worked. And so from there I went on to, from after the military and this, I went to work in the semiconductor industry, where it was one of the largest semiconductor makers in the country, still is today. I think they've got over 30,000 employees. It was based in Boise, Idaho. And I was a trainer, corporate trainer there. At the department, our department had 800 people, and we were the department that built all of the assembly line to manufacture. So maintained all the equipment and did everything. So in order to do that, I had to be given a pretty in-depth understanding of how semiconductors are made, how computer chips work. I'm not a programmer, nor was I a computer engineer, but I was in process management and improvement. And so I got my strong computer background in from that perspective. And then on the user side, I'm just a general user, you know. And from there, I went into the arts, where I did really well in the arts. I was in the technology stuff for a while, but after a couple of years, I realized that not being a computer scientist and not I guess having anything really spectacular to offer them, after 2 years it was just, I could see myself doing the same thing for the next 20 years. And I wasn't that great at computers to where I could excel at other parts of the company. And I had gone from one very structured corporate environment, the military, into another, and I was just like, I was yearning for something a little more creative. And so I left there, spent about a year as a dance instructor, and then ended up working got into the arts as a curator and an art consultant. And what I did, though, is I applied my military training to the arts environment in process improvement management. Within 2 years, I was a director at a gallery in Union Square here in San Francisco. We had over 15,000 square feet of Union Square space. We had 4 locations. We did over $1 million a month just in art. And hundreds of deals done every month, and I curated doesn't show. We sold Picasso, Miro, Chagall, Dali, all kinds of work. And so I was dealing hands-on with very important art, very important work, and dealing with people who could pay for that. And in that realm, I learned that arts was really much different than what my perception of it was from the outside. And one of the things that just fascinated me was, why would somebody spend, you know, $25,000 on a piece of something that big when they could easily spend nothing or any other amount, huh?
get a print.
Or print, right. And so what is it about that? And why do art movements happen? And why does one artist who seemingly is very skilled or superiorly skilled but gets overlooked by somebody else who seemingly is talentless? You know, and the seemingly talentless people seem to often garner the huge followings, right? And so what is it? Is it just marketing? And those were the questions I kept asking myself as a curator and talking to people every day just about art. That's what it was. And then trying to figure out how this stuff actually worked. And then one day my life changed. We all have those moments in our life where just like we meet somebody or something happens and it takes everything into a turn. So if you could actually hand me that book, there's a book, the second one down, yeah. Thank you. This book right here, I was at a gallery, it was in Union Square, and I was the manager, the director of the gallery. And I stepped out for lunch, and I came back, and the crew was there, and they're like, "Oh, Leo, you just missed him." And I'm like, "What's up?" And then they said, "Well, this piece just sold, and it was Einstein. It was a pop art Einstein." And they said, "This guy came in, and we just had this great talk, and bought this thing, and he said he sounded just like you." He said he was talking about all the weird stuff you were talking about, and we couldn't get a hold of you because you guys would have totally hit it off. But here it is, and here's the book he wrote. And then I looked at it, it was like art and physics. And I was like, wow, that's right up my alley. You know, these are two things I happen to know something about. And so I read the book, and it totally changed my perspective of reality. And one of the main hypotheses in this is that as history of art progressed, the history of science, all of history progresses, you know, at the same rate. And what he discovered, he was a medical doctor here in the Bay Area, not either a physicist or an artist, but he's a medical doctor. But he had learned that at very high levels, at every field, it becomes an art form. It doesn't matter what it is. Everybody says, whoever excels at whatever they do, they will tell you it's really more of an art form than anything else. So all of the greatest accomplishments of humanity are works of art. And it's the physics that make it happen. What is Salvador Dali but an alchemist, right? The artists in general are alchemists. And so part of the main hypothesis. Now, keep in mind, like also, I was dealing with works like Salvador Dali, and my big interest was surrealism. That was my favorite area, and he draws some parallels as art progresses, the same ideas are examined in art as in science. Major steps forward are made in parallel that examine similar concepts without even being known to each other. So there's like the idea that this is how the saying, an idea whose time has come, that he's actually documented it and how it parallels. So I'll give you the example that really caught me was in surrealism. They were examining concepts of the malleability of time. Salvador Dali's melting watches, right? And other concepts about time and time travel, multiple dimensions, perspective, cubism. What is cubism other than looking at the world through different dimensional eyes? And and he was saying that this is evidence of a collective consciousness at play. That some of them, so while Einstein was working on relativity, the malleability of time, the feasibility of time's bendability was also, if you look like up the poster, the one on the left, that how time and space kind of shift with each other. Those were coming out, and De Chirico and Dali and the artists of that time were all just examining similar time. They would even use the same, rulers and trains, the same symbols to explain stuff, and completely unknown to each other. Nobody knew. Einstein really wasn't into the public realm until 30s, 40s, where he became popular. But these were the early 20s, 1910, 1920. This is when these ideas were first coming out.
Is this akin to the 100th monkey?
Yeah, yeah, very much so. So So
Same thing happens in music as well.
absolutely.
The music is mirroring the general people.
Yeah, and he goes in. He goes there. There's different chapters, and there's a music chapter. There's fine art. There's various chapters. So he goes through. I think Stravinsky is the strongest one that I liked. Yeah, his time continents, and so even though I never met the guy, he passed away about a year ago. He did know who I was, and through some of my work, because I would present his work. I probably sold 1,000 books. I never got a deal or anything, but I was like, I'd keep this and show it to people. And because, you know, part of the deal of an art dealer was education. And because when you're talking to somebody that can spend $30,000 on a work of art, you're never talking about money.
Right.
If you talk about value, the experience, and why it's that, but you don't. Those kind of people, they can spend $30,000 or $300,000, or nothing. Which is nothing is usually what they spend, but it's a whole different experience, I think. And one of the things I found is people with a deep appreciation of art were usually successful in other parts of their life, and because of that success, they recognized something in that artist that paralleled their own experience, and that's what gravitated. Other things as well, but that's what they gravitate towards, so that's what really got me thinking about consciousness and art and science. And before we go into the next section, I was wondering if we could just go around a little bit and talk about what you're interested in. Maybe tell a bit. We're going to do a little group exercise here. Yeah, we can start this way.
Just who we are, I mean?
Yeah, just introduction and what your interest is.
Sure. My name is Jeffrey Schwarm. I have a strong background in science and math, actually. I'm very interested in time, very interested in consciousness, and very interested in quantum mechanics. So this topic of today's activity seems pretty interesting to me.
Great, thanks.
My name is Matt McCulley. I'm interested in the Institute of Noetic Science in the sense of all the projects they've got going are things that I've sort of had minor versions of, and so as far as I can tell. And I have an avant-garde art degree. I have a business degree. I have been studying the occult and magic and expanding consciousness for a long time, but only recently, in the past 2 years, have I found a community. And that has completely shifted my experience of what I know or think I know. I love playing around with concepts. I have my own theories. So I'm just here to learn more.
Great.
My name is Anna. I'm very interested in also in quantum mechanics and also like everything that is related to it's a bio-neuroemotion, bio-neuromotions, I guess is the translate. And I've been like reading a lot and watching a lot of videos about that, and I'm just very interested in it. And I thought it was great to attend.
Great.
I'm Vicki, and I have interest in consciousness and quantum physics. I don't know much about this particular subject, so just thought I would come and listen.
I'm Barbara. I have an art background. I was a painter, also illustrator, and strong interest in the natural world and conservation, and recently studying Buddhism. And I don't know, I'm interested in science, physics, and spirituality and how they all relate. And yeah, so that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Yeah.
You know,
Huh?
you know, I have more of a consciousness, spirituality kind of background, and I'm not the slightest bit of a scientist. However, what little bit I have read and learned about science, the way I'll say it, is proving spiritual concepts that have existed for years.
Yeah.
And then the kind of stuff that you're talking about is always fascinating to me. Like what has, I mean, physics has a way of showing us how life really works. and then there's what we think.
Right.
about. And what we think is very different from how it really works. And while I don't have that kind of scientific brain to get into the stuff like you have, I just love finding that out, because to me that's the mystery / magic of life, is that place where the unknown meets this world, and how that there actually is a science to it. It's not just random and luck.
There's a science to randomness, which we'll get into. All right, great, thanks. So I am recording for this. I'm going to post it on a private video, I don't know, on YouTube. This is also in preparation for, these posters were created for the 2016 Science and Non-Duality Conference. I was accepted as a presenter there, and they accepted my abstract, which is also up there. It's written as a poem, and then an outline. And the outline, the posters are available for free. You can download them off of academia.edu. You could even go online and do that now if you want, although they're looking, you don't need to. Later you can do it if you want to reference. So I'm just going to be following the outline that I put forth there, because what this is let me back up a little bit. Before we get into this, I think we should do a little of this equipment in front of you. So one of the things I do right now, like if you look over here and you see on the lower posters, you see the Azoth pyramid. I have used what we're going to talk about tonight to do installations at Maker Faire, World's Fair, bigger art and tech festivals, and I just got invited to do Alameda Mini Maker Faire.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. They're free tickets, yeah. You got tickets already?
Oh,
you got it. Oh, yeah.
But they're free, yeah.
July 6th, I think. 6th or 8th, I don't know. I got
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it's the first week of July. And but we just finished Maker Faire, so we have a 10-foot tall pyramid that people sit in, and we use this along with other equipment to induce meditative states. And there's multifold reasons for that. So behind me you see these lights. This is actually a very advanced piece of equipment. There are 10 independently operating quantum computers in there hooked up to LEDs. And the computing data is sensitive enough to where it's actually, it is influenced by our consciousness. And so I'll be as that, and I'm saying that now because that's going to sound very mysterious, but at the end of today, it's going to make sense. Okay? And I never really got into meditation because, one, I grew up Catholic, and there's never time to meditate. But we were too busy worshiping, I guess. No. But it gave me that grounded experience, and so I never pursued the practice of meditation, even when people were talking about all the benefits, and I was great, because it was just like, I got to dedicate, 8 years or 3 years or whatever, or go on these retreats that are 10 days and excruciating. I don't want to do that. I don't really see the cost-benefit analysis isn't working out for me. That was what's going on subconsciously. And so until I got involved into this stuff, even when I knew intellectually about the benefits of meditation, it just wasn't there for me. I wasn't going to do it until I came across the technologies. Technologies made it accessible. So this is one of the things we actually use in our installations. And there are a number of these on the market. Deepak Chopra's got one. And there's a number of them. These have been around since the 60s. This is actually a pretty good one. And go ahead and try. There's 2 headphones and 2 pairs of glasses. And you're welcome. Yeah. I'm not quite sure if it's... I'm going to turn this down a little bit. Let's just give you a sample on the sound.
Yeah, we'll share this one.
And So if you've ever been in been camping and you stare at a campfire and you go into like this little trance, kind of space out, that is entrainment. It means you're, hey, how's it going?
Sure, have a seat.
This is my son, Emmanuel.
Oh,
Hey, Emmanuel.
very good.
So what these mimic is what's going on inside your brains right now. So you have thousands or billions of neurons firing in your brain, and what they are, those are your senses. That's what your senses are. Yeah, you want to keep your eyes closed when you have the glasses on.
Oh.
Yeah, it won't hurt you.
No,
I mean,
I don't know.
you could do one or the other twice. It's an immersive experience. It's a very immersive experience.
So tell me what the glasses do.
So what they are doing is flashing light at a frequency. So like, we all know what meditation is, but there's different types of meditation. And technically, a meditative state is defined as your brain waves operating over a significant period of time within a frequency, within a guided frequency. I think I have.
Are we setting those lights off?
We're always setting those lights off. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
they are changing?
Oh yeah, there's 10 lights. Each of the lights are identical in design. That one down there, we'll get to that later. But then there's 8 different colors. And then, so they're going to modulate. The colors, and over here, we're collecting data. And we're collecting data. I'm actually conducting a timed experiment right now. And we're collecting data, and the sensor is right in front of the fan, and the sensor is the same technology as this. So the data, so these colors represent frequencies. Right, so these colors are also, you can equate them with numbers. And it's the foundation of the inventions and the various other things we have going. But when I talk about quantum mechanics and quantum stuff, it's because these are quantum computers. And what it is there's one right here. Somebody could hand me that, actually.
That little box?
Yeah. Thanks. This is one. And solid state processor. Solid state just means there's no moving parts. And inside here, this little silver box is where the quantum tunneling occurs. And if you go to Wikipedia's got a wonderful, description of quantum tunneling. It's also called electron tunneling. If you ever follow any news, science blogs, about 5 years ago, right around 5 years ago, is when they started hitting news posts where say, because of this particular phenomenon that occurs in labs, teleportation may be possible, right? And this is the technology they were talking about. And it's not teleportation. I can tell you that right now. But it seems odd because what happens in here defies the laws of Newtonian causation. And we'll get into the specifics about that in a bit. But these computers, like I said, are quantum computers. So when I talk about a unified theory of time, consciousness, and quantum mechanics, it's our consciousness affecting those quantum computers and how those quantum computers tell us the time and what they do with time. And what I do, we will be, they're kind of in order up there. It's not possible just to turn on those back 2 lights, is it?
No.
Okay, I might have to turn these up a little. If it gets too dark, let me know, because we will be referencing these all night. So the upper left one, A Brief and Simple History of Quantum Mechanics, is some of the key elements that led me to this theory on how this stuff works. And why I started looking at this, I think, is important as well, and how I came about this. I was looking for, I was in the process of like closing a gallery, opening a gallery, changing places, and always thinking about the next show. If you're a curating show, you're always thinking about the next show, always. And so I was like, what is this consciousness thing? Specifically I was looking at how does inspiration and creativity work synaptically to create art movements and great artists. That was like, how does this stuff work? And so, because I knew there was something there. And the reason I knew there was something there is because something that happened when I was like 6 years old. And my brother and I were playing hide and seek in our neighborhood. And it was a family neighborhood. We had aunts and uncles within a couple blocks, and so we could be gone all day. It was not unusual. And there was a house, I can't remember why, but it was empty. My brother and I went in there, and we found an old refrigerator to hide in. And so we're hiding in the refrigerator, and one of the kids that we were playing with came in and opened the door, found us, probably said something, closed the door and ran off and locked us in.
Oh, man.
And my brother's 5, I'm 6-ish, right in there, and we couldn't get out. And we were kicking and screaming, and nothing. Nobody came. And we ended up passing out. My mother, who was probably about a block or so away, for no Newtonian reason, has a panic attack. She's like, there's something wrong with my kids. She runs outside and starts yelling for us. Nobody's around. There's no reason for her to know this, but she does a beeline for the house that we're in, goes right to the kitchen, goes right to the refrigerator, opens it up, and we're practically dead. We're barely alive. And called the ambulance, they come in, everything's fine. They said another minute or two, it's possible we wouldn't, but we were that close. We were that close.
They put you on oxygen?
Probably, I don't remember. You know, when you're 6 years old, you don't have a PhD in science, or you don't know what's not possible. So we grow up in this little town in Idaho, just thinking, there's that connection there. You can't fib to mom. She knows. She just knows. And so that experience sort of stayed with me throughout my life. It's nothing I dwell on or anything, but when I came across this stuff, I'm like, well, of course there's something to that. And so that I'm going to reference to that again. And so that when I started formulating my unified theory, that was one of the experiences I would often draw back to. It was like, if that works, how does that work? Because there's a scientific explanation for everything. And it may debunk what people think is the real reason. Sometimes just take the whole world, the Earth is the center of the universe. There was an immense amount of research and theories and proof to show that that was a fact. You can go back. Copernicus and the ongoing analyzation looks at it. Today we have the flat Earth. You look at the flat Earth stuff, there's some really rational arguments, rationally sounding arguments. Science can be, and data can be molded to fit a personal agenda, And so in my just general research, I came across this video called the Global Consciousness Project, and it was based out of Princeton. The Princeton Anomalies Research Labs had built this network of computers, of these types of computers. There's like 20, 30 of them around the world that were basically measuring the consciousness of the Earth 24/7 as an experiment.
What was it called? The
Global Consciousness Project. And it was there's a bunch of stuff on it. It became famous because the sensors went off the Richter scale. They just went crazy, started going crazy about 3 hours before the first plane hit 9/11. And so that was a big question mark as to how that actually worked. By the end of today, I'll explain exactly how that worked, why that worked. But it was the exact same data that we see here being collected here, and that's being generated on there, and it's in here. So I'll pass this around. You can pass it. So let me see over here.
I didn't know you could buy a quantum computer.
Can't right now.
Oh,
But we're working on getting them commercially available again. But most quantum computers are big, giant, multi-million-dollar computers that are doing qubit processing, and they're spinning particles at subatomic levels and doing all kinds of fancy stuff. And they're pretty cool. I've talked to the people that run them. And so this is a different, the world of quantum computing is just like, imagine what the video game industry was like in 1983 compared to today. You know, that's what we can say that quantum computing is like in its infancy right now. So right now it's reserved for the big people, the big guys. You got to have $1 million to get yourself a big thing. This is how I see is it's going to provide quantum computing to the masses, to everybody. And they will work together. The big computers will work in tandem with these small ones.
Leo, what is it? Give me a simple definition of quantum computer.
Okay, in this case, what is a quanta? What is quantum? Because you see all kinds of stuff, quantum karate, quantum fitness, quantum this, quantum that, you know.
A measure, right?
Huh?
It's a unit. It's a single thing.
It's unmeasurable, really.
It is, but all of that is correct, but what it specifically is and how it came about, and we're going to, this is a great question, and that goes right into the history of this. And about 200 years ago, our first study of the dualistic nature of light and time came out in a double-slit experiment by a scientist by the name of Young. And you can look this up, the Young experiments, the Young double-slit experiments, and they started looking at the unusual properties light held. One of the properties was that over long distances of period, light seemed to break apart in small fragments. And they couldn't predict where the fragments, what it would break up into. And so what they called this was the quantization of light. And then a single light element is a quanta. That quanta is also the smallest measure. It's called a Planck length, which is the size of one element of light. Light is, but you can't call it a particle of light. I call it element because think of it as a wavy string, but it's a massless packet of energy. And for us, it comes from the sun. But there's light emanating to us from the whole universe, right? But the sun, all of the light that we see from other galaxies, other stars, is all filtered through our sun. Really, I think there's only one place you could observe the universe that was not affected by our sun, and that would be the dark side of the moon. That's the only place you could actually observe our universe without the sun observing it, without the sun filtering it. Anyway, that's a whole different. But quanta is, does that answer? So quantum physics is really the study of light and what light does under particular circumstances. There's lots of different forms. That's light. And what is light? It's a frequency. It's a vibration, energy, right? Just like Tesla said, I got one of those quotes, if you want to understand the nature of the universe, think of frequency, vibration. And I like to put it also wave, tidal forces. That's one of the primary movers of universe. So the double slit experiment is one of the cornerstone experiments, and it's been studied for over 200 years, and they still can't explain it. So this is a cornerstone scientific experiment that's done in every advanced labs physics in the universities. They've all got this set up in some way, and they're still exploring it. And one of the most mysterious elements of it, without getting into, we could talk for 2 hours just on this, but one of the most mysterious elements of it is they would take a particle emitter and an electron emitter and shoot it through these two parallel slits. And depending on where they measured it, depended on whether the light looked like a single, like a wave, or it looked like just two slits. So there was really unusual because it defied the causation they were trying to get. And then there's another element of it which people are really reluctant to address, and that's called retro causation. And that is doing the future actually affecting something that's already happened in the past. And there's this, one of the experiments was that the emitter would look like a particle or a wave depending on whether they recorded it downstream. So something that happened completely after the fact had an impact on a process beforehand. How does that work? And one of the things, one of the components I like to put out is on the speed of light. For earthly purposes, I define the speed of light as instantaneous. For our purposes, I mean, like for most of us, 1 second is instant, right? And a piece of light is much faster than what we can perceive happens in a second. So I like that idea of instantaneousness, and we're going to address the concepts of infinity as well. So the double slit experiment, like I said, 200 years. So there's no way any of us, I've only been studying this for a couple of years, intensely for like 5, doing experiments and stuff, 5 years. And so nobody should feel bad if they're not experts in quantum physics when they walk away from here. And every time I go through this, somebody asks a question, so I learn something too. Everything is a learning process. And when I looked at the Global Consciousness Project and said, oh, this data is coming out. And so you look at, when we take a break, which we're going to do here in a few minutes, we'll look at the data. And what it basically is like an electronic coin flipper is a good way to think about it. And it shoots out an emitter, or an electron, and it comes out either heads or tails, right? Now, if you have a coin, ting, heads or tails, what are the chances of one or the other going to turn up, basically? 50-50, right? So this is shooting flipping the coin 200 times a second, right? So you would get 200 heads, 200 tails. On this, you get up or down, right? So just call up heads, down tails. Not one is better than the other. It's like left or right. And what their premise was, what their hypothesis was, people interacting with it created these long streams of heads or tails that defied the probabilistic laws of randomness. And they could correlate these with real-world events. And the statistics that came about. Now, this was done over decades of work at Princeton, right? And so they continued making the random event generators. They continued making the experiments, conducting the experiments, made them as controlled as possible. There are over 100 white papers, peer-reviewed white papers on this technology that you can go out and find. And they came to the conclusion that this was a sensor, basically, that was sensitive enough not only to be detected by people in a room, but even there was a non-local effect. So earthly distances did not seem to have... anybody know who Edgar Mitchell is? Edgar Mitchell was the founder of the Institute of Noetic Science, and he was, I think, the 7th man to walk on the moon, 7th person to walk on the moon. So he was an astronaut. He conducted a New Thought experiment coming back from the moon that you will never see in mainstream.
I'm sorry, what was his name again?
Edgar Mitchell. Okay. He was a captain in the Navy, test pilot. And has everybody seen what there's generally called the psychic cards, the 5 cards? They got the wave, the square, the circle, triangle. It's got the 5 elements, and then the thing is, it's a simple test. You guess which one is the person's thinking of, right? So he conducted it 50,000 miles away from Earth on his way back from the moon. And the results were irrefutable. He had an effect on it. It was beyond the realms of chance, that far away. Question?
Yeah, what do you mean by had an effect on him? Was he the interviewer, the interviewee, or how did...
if I remember it back, he was the one guessing to the cards, and there was somebody else on the Earth doing it.
I have my own experiment for that.
Yeah.
So
And
controlled.
it was a controlled, yeah. And it was...
Peak.
Huh?
He couldn't peak.
Right.
He was on the moon.
Yeah, he couldn't...
But also distance is irrelevant.
Yeah. What that led me to is when we get into the details of this, that's one of the things I'm going to base the premise on, is that when we're talking about the notion of instantaneous communication, that is what I'm basing this on. Is that the fact that we can communicate with somebody on the other side of the earth has already been demonstrated by something much further than any earthly distance through that experiment alone. There's been, and there's many other experiments that I'll reference that happen on the earth.
Now, is that related at all to spooky effects at a distance?
That is the spooky effect at a distance, the part of it. So like exactly that is it. And the reason it's spooky is because you don't understand it.
Right.
Most people are afraid of stuff they don't understand, right? And maybe that's a bit stretched, but in science, I'm going to turn this up a little bit. What's that?
Cautious.
Yeah, and there's a lot of just turn that up a little bit. So, so these back here are the same sensors that they were studying for years at Princeton, but what I think that a lot of their research was misguided, because what they were focused on was proving the same thing over and over again, and that was that individuals can have an effect on it, and it was really focused around special skills or gifted people and trying to have like a special thing happen. And they couldn't explain to the doubters, of which I was one, why it worked the way it did, and the fact that it wasn't as controlled as they'd want it. And so when I approached it, when I saw the newscast, I went and looked at all the websites and everything, and I think it was the I.C.R.E.A.M, International Consciousness Research Labs, had an open call for citizen scientists. And they were discussing consciousness, and I have they're in there. I have certifications like in teaching this stuff, and so I was like, wow, this is something I actually know something about consciousness, this stuff, and because of my solid state or my background with the micron technology, the semiconductors, I was like, this is something I could really I find interesting, and I have the skill set to actually do this, and so that's how I initially got into it, and let me go back to, actually, is anybody ready for a break?
No.
You guys, you want to go? You want to take a few minutes? All right. I've got some stuff over here. I'm going to grab just some water real quick.
Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe we should let you have a break.
Yeah.
Sounds really good.
Let me see here. Mm-hmm. Actually, it would be good if you take this second to come up here and look at this, and I can. So these change the iterations from minimum, I think it's like maybe 10 bits per second all the way up to 200 bits per second. And you can see this right here, right? And so this is basically this upper and lower division, this upper and lower lines are control limits. So statistically, if the line, the data is within those lines, that's within standard calibration. When it goes out of those lines, that means there's some human influence going on. Now, what's amazing about this, now we're all standing around it, we're now becoming entangled with it because you're aware of it, you know what it is. I'll explain how that works a little bit later. But not only are we affecting this, but the entire world is affecting it, because what we're talking about is fluctuations in our atmosphere, and this is obviously within our atmosphere. And so the colors over there, it's like 10 of these lines going on. And here you can see this actually has how many ones or zeros go up in a row. We can do some other things as far as putting in comments, but what's really interesting is the statistics score, the z-score up here, high z and low z, which converts to odds, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. And what I figured out on here, this is where the relative come in, the computer has a clock, right? And I need to math this out a little bit, but nobody's been ever to really explain what's the difference between up and down is. You know, because not one is better than the other. Now this is like pure, I mean, this is really more speculation than anything at this point on this one particular element, and that is, I have figured out how to utilize this, tie them into a clock, so they can show us what's called time dilation, and that's how time moves forward and backwards. And we'll get into the details on that in a little bit. But this could potentially be time speeding up and slowing down a little bit. But even if those are not variables, we can tie this, because what this is detecting is spatial distortions in an electron tunneling field. And what we'll show you in a bit is how time and space are two sides of the same coin. When space bends, time bends with it. And so when I reference this is, so you can see right now, we're focused, we're getting, and then as soon as I started talking and we all gathered around here, we start seeing a trend occur. And so
it's measuring energy, is that what it's doing? Or
kind of, you could say that. It's
vibration?
Vibrational resonance
Yeah.
at a very subatomic level, at the electron level.
Why
Is what it
isn't
is.
it always outside one line or the other?
Because the calibration points were done when there's nobody around. Absolutely, they were done in controlled experiments over thousands of trials, when not only was nobody around, nobody even knew they were programmed to where nobody even knew when they were actually being calibrated. So,
Well, how do they isolate themselves, the person who's doing that? So how do they isolate themselves?
that was the trick, is like even the operators couldn't know exactly when they were recording and doing all the calibration. Because like in this, I've done probably 200 plus experiments with this. This has been at events with tens of thousands of people, you know, and so they're slightly entangled. I think most of the charge is lost after it's unplugged, you know, but while it's plugged in and there's power running through it, we're the primary people on
Well, it
this.
would seem to me that, unless I'm thinking incorrectly, that the human element would impact that all all the time,
Yeah.
constantly.
in
It
some
does.
way.
That's what the calibration is.
Yeah, like
That's
how
exactly
close
what the
do you need to
calibration
be
means.
in order to do it.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't
Uh,
matter.
Doesn't
I,
have
mean,
any-
I mean, there's a whole ton of
What
people
Right.
watching the Warriors game at the
Exactly.
at the theater. You
So
know,
it's the waves that are.
Exactly. So that,
What's the most significant effect you've seen?
oh, all kinds. I've got a number of experiments. Actually, I didn't bring that poster, but I've got a number of experiments that are on our website. I've got a couple here. I'll show you. But I've seen this thing go clear off the chart
Have you ever
at key
directed-
moments.
Directed people to send it one way or another?
Hundreds of times.
And it's,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
just obvious.
At art events in particular,
Right.
I'd set up
Now,
experiments,
is that
quick
also
experiments.
Is that also
and
a situation where, because you said to send it one way, it's going to do that before it even starts?
Partly, yeah. So I'm always a part of it.
Yeah.
I can't separate myself from it.
But also, even,
Yeah.
even the event of the people you're working with, they also have a period of time prior that will affect.
Sure, and even after. So part of my hypothesis, this is a good point, part of my hypothesis was after I was looking at, okay, well, if consciousness, after I initially saw the stuff, I thought about it hard for a couple of weeks, and then I came up with a general theory of, well, if consciousness works this way, X, Y, Z, what we should see over the course of a period of time, if we can do a timed experiment, obviously I was thinking of art events, that if somebody comes in contact with it and then they move on, they're still connected to it. If the next person comes in contact with it and moves on, they're still connected to it, and so forth. That should result in a cumulative effect of data if there's coherence happening. And art events are the best way because there's little conflict. You know, rarely do you go to an art and like pick a fight with an artist because you don't like their stuff. You know, I mean, usually it's cordial. If you don't like something, you just move on and look at something you like. You know, and there's also points where if there's like if there's a central speaker or something where everybody's doing the same thing, then like if we had heart rate monitors, we would know that all of our heart rates are beginning to synchronize. Yeah. Now this is, I'm just assuming that it's part of it is the general benevolence of our intentions. You know, if you go someplace, let's just say where people are adversarially predispositioned to each other, you might not see this at all. Because like, what it's doing, it's detecting waves of coherence, right? So one of the ways I like to explain it is, imagine this is like a buoy. It has a buoy-like effect. So look at the lights. Look at these lights. It's better actually to look at these. Let me move over here. We kind of got an idea of the data. So you look at these lights. So imagine there are buoys in a swimming pool that's perfectly still. Nobody's in it. And the buoys are floating on the top. So it detects waves, right? But they're anchored on the bottom, so they're not going to, so they're just solid. So, and instead of this close, they're 10 feet. There's a 10 feet diameter. Now, somebody jumps in at the other end of the pool. One person right in the middle. What's going to happen? They're going to create a wave. Right? So imagine this was like 10 feet long. The first crest of the wave would hit this, and then this, and this, and you would get that wave-like effect, right? But what would happen if 20 people jumped in the whole pool at the same time? How would you be able to detect which affected which? You pretty much wouldn't. Yeah. Too chaotic, too much chaos. That's the same concept as over there, is we are in a sea of consciousness. Right? And every time our heart beats, we send out, through tidal forces, we send out ripples in space-time. And that's what these are detecting. But it's not just us. Now, somebody mentioned the sports game. So a couple of years ago, I did an experiment, and it was in San Francisco City Hall during a big sports event. I think it was baseball this time. This was probably 2012 or 13, 14, right when I first started. It was one of my first public experiments. And I saw something that was really unusual, and that was just a steady stream. Within the guidelines, it was pretty close to the mean, but it was just solid state all across it. And so I think that's what had, even though I was 4 blocks away, 3 blocks away where the equipment was, I think that was what was caused. There was such a strong, coherent, you know, if you're sitting in this case was really different, because what happens if you're at a typical sports event, you have one team versus the other team and you have both sides. This was an event with all San Francisco fans.
Oh.
Because they were watching the game on the big screen, and so they were all Frisco fans. And that created a coherence. So you can see as you look at this, these are each updating 200 times per second, but as you look at them, you will notice over a period of time these wave-like features coming in. So when you look at this, though, think of those numbers. Think of those fluctuating things, and think of these as numbers instead of colors. You know, and so what those are is they unveil a level of reality where the laws of probability and chance are a little bit different, right? And this is what I mean by that. This is a good way to explain it. I don't have a remote for this. Let me do this. So actually, let me do it just with this one. So
are the colors organized so that they do a rainbow, or are they strictly random?
There's no programming in there. It's a non-deterministic data stream. There's no software that says do it, and it's just a continuous stream. And I've got an illustration on how it works up there. But there's some pretty phenomenal. We're not going to get into detailed experimentation tonight. We'll do a couple of cursory things. But if you were to do this for over a couple of days or live with it, it's pretty amazing with the things you'll notice. But I've never seen all of these lit up at the same time. It's never happened.
You mean the same color?
All the same color. It's been close a few times at big events where I've had it at the apex of some really big events. We've seen it, get close, 8 colors, almost 9, things like that. But more often you'll see dualistic colors, complementary colors. When a shift happens in the room, you'll see a shift happening here. The last event we had, this was the centerpiece, and we had people sitting facing each other with the glasses and the headset in the pyramid with this in the center. And virtually every time a new couple got in there, whether they knew each other or not, you would see the light shift for them, and then they would get out and there would be chaos, and then you would see, so you could see the frequencies of it. So what are they actually detecting? In that field, you have an electron shooting through a force field, right? And when it goes through, it either changes state or it doesn't change state, the charge, right? So if it changes state, it's translated to a 0. If it doesn't change state, it's translated to a 1. And what those basically, those are spatial distortions created by our electromagnetic charge. And that charge is managed by our state of mind, our health, and our understanding of how it works, I think. Like I said earlier, if you understand something better, it tends to optimize itself. And now look at the different complementary colors. And if I'll get into some, I will show. So we're going to do something. It's like a die. If I roll a die, imaginary die. If I roll a die, what are the chances you're going to get your number?
1 out of 6.
1 out of 6, right? So this has 8 colors. When I turn it back on, it's going to cycle red, green, blue, and it's going to land on a 4th. That 4th color is non-deterministic randomness, right? There's 8 colors. What are the chances, if you were to meditate and try to focus on a color, that it would come that color? What would be your chances?
1 out of 6.
8 colors.
Oh, 8 colors. 1 out of 8.
No.
Hold on. I think you have about a 60% chance, 1 out of 3.
No. Anything but 1 in 8. We don't know.
What?
We know it's not a 1 in 8 chance, but determining it on the room and the intention and all the other things going, all the other things affecting it, it's anything but 1 in 8. It could be higher, it could be lower.
Oh, okay.
Right? But we can do that.
Sounds like the underpinnings for a basic scientific method test.
Oh, there's already been done.
Yeah.
They've been done. Yeah, many of them. And also on the testing and stuff. Like I said, this has been under research at Princeton for decades. There have been all kinds of experiments. I have no interest in controlled experiments. I want real-world, semi-controlled, heuristic experiences.
Nice.
You know, because it's only practical to us if we can, and if the only practical use is entertainment, so be it, right? That's a pretty good use. That's a pretty good. There's a lot more than that, but so I'm going to turn this on. So, but before we do that, let's all agree on a color and look at the color. You have to be able to see it, or we could just pick a color that's here. What's the dominant color?
Green.
Green. So let's just go with green. Okay. So I'm going to turn this on. Okay, we got a blue. Oftentimes it'll migrate towards that color. But if you rolled a die and you said, oh, I want number 3, and you got number 4, would you think that the die didn't work? No. You knew that if you rolled it enough times, you were going to get your 4 about 1 out of 6 times. But we also know that it is possible you could roll 13 6s in a row. You could roll 40 3s in a row. That is possible. But what are the chances? Every time you roll that, the laws change a little bit, right? So what this does is it has that effect. Not only is there 8 colors, but literally the power of our own heartbeats has an effect on it. So if you're don't
Thinking green now.
don't think just it often goes to the next color because it's the resonance. Because how we're actually affecting it is through our heartbeat. So what's the difference between thinking about a color and feeling a color?
What's the difference?
It's a big difference between thinking of a color and feeling a color. right? Because, like, so some of the experiments I've done at the gallery stuff. Now, keep in mind, we might be talking about this one thing for an hour, but I would say, imagine yourself in a red car, wearing a long red dress, and you're with somebody wearing a red suit, and you're driving down the freeway, and you pass a field of red roses, and you drive into it, you know, and then you bring out all of this red stuff, and then see what happens. Oftentimes we would take an orange and just sit it there, and people would walk in, the next color would be orange. We'd take a red apple, we'd take a banana, and just like see that stuff. One of the experiments I did, we had 4 lights, and then we had 4 canvases, and we had 4 colors, and we'd tell people to walk up and pick a color and start painting. Didn't tell them about the experiment, and we would see that the color they chose and started painting, the light would change that color. Quite often. Not 100%. And yeah. So this is the foundation. This is the foundation of many. I've got a whole suite of inventions. This could be utilized in all kinds of things: homes, cars, all types of stuff. We'll get into that in a little bit. But before we get into the theory, I wanted to give you an experience to understand that, because now you have a little bit of experience, yeah, you had the experience of, and you can see these. You see these. And it took me quite a while for us to scrape everything together to get these, but I had the initial concept after looking at all the experiments, and within about 2 or 3 weeks after initially seeing the stuff, I said, well, you need to get all these together. You need to put these things together. And so this is a proof of concept of, and I wouldn't say just this. If you look at what's going on in the software, imagine that was behind this. This would be the foundation of a quantum clock that would allow you to distort time with your consciousness. Because with these data, like I said, when everything is related to time, right? Time it's not a dimension, like a spatial dimension. What it is, it's the other side of space. Imagining time alone, it's like imagining a coin with one side. Can't do it. We're going to get into that here in a bit about the specifics on time. But so there's also a couple of, why don't we have a seat?
Time was purely a result of change.
Change of space, change of travel, right. Help yourself to any of this stuff.
Thank you.
And you're welcome to get up during the thing as well. Just think of this more of a workshop, I think.
Is that one just 10 versions of the one?
Yep.
Are they at all related to each other?
Look at this. Yellow.
Yeah.
You see that? Let me, this is the only one I have of these right now. You're welcome to take a look at it.
Oh, yeah. Well.
So it's a quantum computer because it computes data, ones and zeros, and the core source, data source, is a quantum function.
We turn this off.
Oh, yeah.
Say that again. It's the source.
It's not black, but the black box, the hidden box underneath. It's just like this. It's just like this. That's where the quantum function occurs. That's where the electron tunneling. So I like to think about it as like this. Every chain has a weak link, right? If you have a brick wall, there's going to be one point on the wall that's the weakest. So it's the same way in a force field. In a force field, you're going to have one area that's the weakest, and that electron is going to target that weakness. And that weakness is going to be affected by the spatial distortions going around it. What's distorting the space? The collective effect of consciousness, energy, all the energy around it. And so how I define consciousness...
Is that tunneling? Is that...
Yeah.
I think that's what tunneling is.
Yes.
Going through the
how it goes through it.
Okay.
Exactly. So when this was first discovered, the physicists at the time, this seemed so ridiculous. you will see this, they will even use this as an example. Imagine you had a tennis ball and you were throwing the tennis ball against that wall, right? What are the chances that the tennis ball would just go through the wall?
Yeah, very low.
Right, almost nothing. I mean, it's just ridiculous to even think that it would happen. That's how ridiculous the electron not going through, or going through the thing seemed to be at the time. Now we have a better understanding, it's not so mysterious.
What are we looking at here?
That tied up into that data here translated into light, basically.
Those little couplets on top of it.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
And the
Exact.
little things are little lights, little LED lights.
So that's the light. That's what 10 of those look.
Yeah, you didn't see them rip off the top.
Oh.
I know.
No. They were built by S.C.R.E.A.M, which is the group from Princeton. They're the ones that built it.
So the practical application of this information, what is that?
What is more practical than time and light?
I don't know.
Nothing. They're the most practical elements. They guide our every movement. You can't spend a day without either. So if we have a better understanding of it, there'll be. But I can get into some actual things. But I mean, I think that's, you know, I didn't get in this thing to make gizmos for people to buy, right? That's a part of it, but you know, we're exploring. There has to be a practical use, or there's no utility to it. So I understand that, right? But when people ask me that, generally they're like, what are we going to sell? How are you going to make money with it? That is absolutely of no. I'm not saying that was your motivation, but I hear that. Yeah.
I'm really trying to put together what you're telling us here, which is very interesting, and then I'm like, okay, how do
It'll all tie in by the end.
how do you use this?
It'll all tie in by the end. But some, like I said though, just time and light, you know, are pretty practical. If you have a better understanding of them, you have a better understanding of the nature of the universe and reality. That will lead you to an infinite level, I think, of understanding of other areas. But what's happening here, everybody stare at the light. Don't look at me. I'm going to start talking. Look at the light. Don't look at me. So as you look at the lights, each of them are updating 200 times per second, in addition to being 10 of them. So all of those, that's 2,000 updates per second your subconscious is processing. Just like a movie is made up of individual frames. You can look at each frame and each one is still, but when you put them together, it makes a stream of motion. The same thing is happening here. But what is different here is you are actually forming a neurofeedback loop with those lights. And in doing so, you are all having a shared experience and becoming more entangled together. So this is a catalyst for strengthening the entanglement in groups, for one thing. But what is meditation? It's entering your mind into a flow state, right? So as you're looking at this, it is detecting through your heartbeats spatial distortions at that level, translating that into a light code, basically, that your conscious is affecting. So it's a continuous loop. Therefore, it is helping you enter into a conscious flow state. It is expanding your consciousness in a way that it's never been expanded ever.
So you're impacting it and it's impacting.
It's impacting you. And so what are the benefits of meditation? What happens if we can build environments that enhance the meditative state without any detriment? You know, so imagine this kind of lighting just as background lighting in homes, offices. It would automatically elevate people to a different level, to a higher level of awareness, just by being in there. The sounds we're hearing, these are alpha waves, right? So we're actually getting a light and sound experience together. And so just by going through this, being in the room, hearing this, your consciousness, when I say that, the neuroplasticity, when I say consciousness, your neuroplasticity, your neural path pattern is being affected by the lights. up here. And so that's how the process goes. And how this ties back into here is, if I can go back for a moment.
Should we look at you now?
You can look at me now. But actually, I mean, you can actually, while we're sitting here, you can conduct your own experiments mentally. And that is, if you pick one of the 10 lights, imagine a color, and stare at it. You don't have to do anything other than stare at it and set the intention for that color. You can do that all night long. You know.
But you should direct it with your brain or with your heart.
They're connected. They're the same.
Okay.
So you're suggesting that we have some influence on the energy around us, and the energy around us has influence on us.
I'm not suggesting that. I mean, that's what all the data shows, and I would say that that's been proven.
So when you say stare at a light and look for the color, can you create a color through an emotion then?
Yes, absolutely. Like I said, that's a little bit much to get into fully here, but absolutely, you can see it. And I've seen it manifest in many different ways. You know, if I get excited, like when I've got this at home, if I'm on a phone call and I'm talking about something really positive, red comes up. I know another a woman, her happy color is green. You know, if she wants to feel good, she puts on a green dress. She got green plants in her house. She puts her lamp there. It's green all the time. Her color is green. You know, other people have different. I have a guy in Alameda, not Alameda, I'm sorry, in Oakland. His color is purple. His favorite color is purple. It's purple. He says he tries to sneak up on it because whenever he gets close to it, it turns purple. You know? Yeah. And so if I could go back to the posters a little bit. So we just talked about the quantum tunneling. You know, that's in the lower side. I'm going to address the other two things. We've talked about the double slit, the quantum tunneling, and now M theory and relativity. So we're not going to get into characters or deep history on M theory, but it's what, for the most part, the concept of a multiverse emanated from. Does anybody know, can anybody give a explanation of what multiverse is? You see it in TV shows a lot of times, Star Trek.
Concurrent timelines that split only by a change in single decision. So if today I decide to pick up the cup, okay, but another one I decide not to, those are two separate timelines creating realities both in that moment.
Right.
Okay.
And this, the fundamental evolution of that came from the double slit experiment, in that there were elements of the double slit experiment that couldn't be explained, and so people made the supposition that the light particles, they're disappearing, we don't know where they're at, they must be in other dimensions. And the math shows there are other dimensions. When they get into like complex math theory, they can show that we live in more than 3 dimensions. But those 3 dimensions, until today, for you, were mysterious. Well, I'm going to get into exactly what those are. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to address, how this all sort of came about, in that there's a lot of stuff. I had a radio show where I talked about philosophy, art, and science, and trying to discuss theories on the radio, I had to use analogy. And I started using these analogies on the theory, and it's like, wait a minute, well, that actually works. You know, that makes sense. And so I didn't start out by some of these revelations in time and space, but they came later. But M theory was a big one because personally, I did not buy any of the multiverse stuff. Any of the, there's another me, there's another you. That took an extreme amount of faith, and it's completely untestable. Can't test it. So you can come up with any radical idea and you can math it out and say, well, that's a good theory. It's possible. You can't prove it's not possible. And so whoever's louder just gets all the attention, right? And so I want to say, okay, I didn't buy it, but what's the alternative? What is the alternative? And so the M theory is the multiple dimensions, and then the one on the lower left is relativity, and that's basically Einstein's depiction of relativity, in particular special and general relativity. Does anybody know the difference between special and general relativity? There are a number of videos I would highly recommend. There's a ton of them actually now. on YouTube that are all from 5 to 15 minutes long. They go into details on relativity. Watch, if you have an interest in it, watch the videos 3 or 4 times. You know, I'm going to get into a little bit of it here, but basically it talks about how light and motion happen in space with large bodies, and that light, when it travels around a large mass, bends. So light bends with gravitational fields. And then you have special and general relativity, and then so that explains what's happening on the Earth or out in space. On Earth, it's about time and how we experience time differently. All of us experience time differently. And here's a good example without getting into... Remember I said we talk about time in the future? It turns red. So imagine there's an airplane. It's an airplane. All right. How's that? Better? Slightly better. Just here's an airplane. Here's a person on the ground. Inside the airplane, there's a ball. There's a person bouncing a ball. And the ball is made of light. Okay? A little ball of light here. And then there's a person here monitoring the ball. And the plane is traveling. Now, as the plane travels and the ball is bouncing, the person who's looking at the ball sees it how?
Just up and down.
As up and down.
Relative.
The person here sees it moving like this, right? And the distance can be measured, right? When it gets from here to here and here to here, when they're looking at this, the distance can be measured, and there's a malleability with time. I won't get into that right now. But basically, this person is going to experience this ball from that perspective, and this person is going to experience it. So there's 2 people experiencing the same thing, and if you were to measure, the only thing difference would be the time. There would be a slight time difference between the motion of the ball from here to here between these 2 people.
That's life, living life. We both watched the same movie and you had
2 different experiences. But these are measurable times. It's not, it's like if this person had a clock and this person had a clock, they would be different. And that led us to one of the biggest misunderstandings, biggest misinterpretations in science, I think, of the 20th century. And that's the misinterpretation of Einstein's formula for time. And I got to do it. So
That's due to the faster you go, the slower time gets.
this is it right here. Right. So this is the formula. And that's exactly, they said, so this is 1 minus the velocity divided by the speed of light squared. Now, this is actually the speed of light squared in a vacuum. It's about 300,000 meters per second squared. It's a big number, right? And you have stationary time, you have the time in motion, and when you put all this together, what it appears to be is that if you approach the speed of light, as you approach the speed of light, your time measurement drops to 0. Therefore, this is where the speculation comes in. If you exceed the speed of light, then time moves backwards, right? That's where all the scientific time travel sci-fi stuff comes from, which I think is awesome. I've written some sci-fi stuff about time travel. It's really great, but there's a point where speculation and fact are blended as one, and that's what's happened specifically here. But I interpret this as something wholly different, and that is, like I said earlier, looking at time and space as a coin. You know, this is kind of it's like a 4-sided coin. You know, and there's a couple of problems with that concept about moving space, because people are assuming like.
Why is it a 4-sided coin?
Oh, four-sided coin in that there's time and distance, velocity, and the speed of light. And the reason why you look at this, it was like I said, imagine a coin with one side. You can't do it. That's the same thing as looking at time as just this. Looking at time as just the velocity as you approach the speed of light, because that totally takes out of the rest of it, right? And the rest of it tells us there's a dualistic nature to time. And that is time as we experience it, and then time of the ages. This is what's happening in the stars, which cannot be malleable. But what this thing does right here, this function right here, gives us time dilation, the malleability of time. So if time and space are malleable, look at this poster right here, right? As this space curved into this, so does time. And when I say the time curves, that means our ability to measure it. How do we measure time? With clocks. What are clocks affected by? The laws of physics. If you have something in motion, there's a concept called drag. That drag is what time is. Okay? So looking at time, for one thing, light, as we talked about earlier, has no mass. So to assume that's the reason why it is what it is. That's why it's light. To assume that if anything could travel at the speed of light, it would have to have no mass, which means it couldn't be in physical form. So that is where a lot of the speculation comes in. So did anybody see the movie? Question?
Well, I was in a lecture series when I was young on time, and I think that this might help a little bit. If you take a particle or an object, anything, and accelerate towards the speed of light, the faster it goes, the theory is the more it starts moving through time and less through space. So if you were to observe it and it's moving really, really fast, it looks like it's not moving at all, because you're seeing it. That's how it was described to me. Is that
that's what happens. Sure, that's what happens in, I would say, like an experiment like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, is that within the vacuum or not?
Those are usually, yeah, definitely within a vacuum.
The other thing that I thought was strange about that was that the only way to, if you accelerate a mass to the speed of light, it explodes. It gets too big. The mass continues. Yeah, but there's still a breakdown in that they're measuring, they're making the assumption that that is going to have an effect on mass, things with mass. You know, so what I'm saying is, like, it's just like oil and water, mixing the two. You're not going to get speed of light travel with mass. Yeah.
Period. And that's where anybody see the movie Interstellar?
Yes.
There's a premise in there. I'm going to go right there to the next poster, actually. The premise in there is it's a twin paradox, and that's that they use this formula, and they say, well, if you had two twins that one gets on a speed of light ship and travels across the universe and comes back, then the person on Earth is going to age more. And then in that movie, it was put forward the father goes off, travels the universe, the daughter grows older than the father, right? That's all based on this time. And
wasn't that just in the news not long ago? Who was the guy that went up to space and he had a twin brother? And he came down. And
oh, he was lighter. He was lighter.
He was a little bit taller.
His physiology.
Yeah.
oh yeah, definitely. But that doesn't have anything to do with time or age. No. He didn't get younger.
Lack of gravity.
Lack of gravity, definitely.
Oh, is that what
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of things.
Yeah. That's one of the problems with deep space travel. Anyway, that's a little bit different. But the twin paradox, when you take into account this, there's no paradox. If a twin goes, let's just say they do go to the speed of light and they're gone for 2 years and they come back, the twins are the same age.
Really?
There's no scientific, not that I'm aware of, and I've looked, there's no experiments that even hint that you can age slower the faster you run. You know, I mean, they speculate and say it's such a minute amount that somebody who's in a train or drives a car, they're going to age 34 seconds younger. They're going to be 34 seconds younger. That's just, there's no, that's pure speculation. And who cares if we're talking about things like that at that level?
I thought that was pretty much not proven, but almost a fact. That
No.
the twins came together, that they would be a different age.
Right. That's what I would say. That's what I'm saying is like one of the biggest misinterpretations I think of this is that it's not a fact at all. It's pure speculation, and it's backed up by some math, but there's no experiment. And this right here, what you're experiencing here, gives an alternative to that.
Right. You know, I think that they have accelerated some particles really fast, and they normally decay within a certain amount of time, and so, you know, when the fast particle comes back, it decays later than the one that was standing still. So, I mean, that's one way to verify that.
Well, I think
that
you might also look at the factor of if they're respecting the particle decay.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
At one level, there's this. The failure of experimentation is that the observer causes the result. You know, as you're talking about things that are small as particles, you have to be concerned with how much are you influencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
That's definitely.
But again, none of us live in a particle collider.
Yeah.
Right? How does this stuff work in the real world? Yeah. You know, how are we applying these things to our everyday experience? And none of us are going to travel at the speed of light. We'll be lucky if we travel the speed of sound, you know. But what does travel at the speed of light? Light and our thoughts and our energy. That is, for the most part, instantaneous, right? And so when we think about time and time travel and malleability, think about the bending of time. So like when a mass, this has been experimented on, and that is when a mass it's a planet, and there's a distant star, the light will bend around it, right? Just as time would if you were to measure it. And so those are spatial distortions created. Our body has mass. Like on one of the posters it says, what is E if M is me? And our mass is much more than our weight, because there's an electrochemical power plant up here and in here creating power and energy completely in continuous flux. And our ability to, I think, make that energy malleable and change is what changes. So when we're looking, we've seen the effects, some of the effects on this. Let's just make the assumption that that's what it is. We're going to get into the mechanics of it in a bit. That means that we're able to basically affect time in a very small amounts that's measurable with our consciousness. We can bend and malleable time. What we can't do is make it go backwards. And there's limitations on to what we can do with it. You know, you can't bring it to a stop, but we know that if we were able to measure that to a small enough degree, and I think we can convert it with what we have here, we can show how our own consciousness affects time. Because just like the planets bend the time, we're mass. There's no difference than the mass of those planets and the mass of ourselves.
Well, one of the things that I experience out of meditating is that I have, like the way I like to say it is I have 48 hours in the day. I have plenty of time.
Yeah.
I'm never stressed about time.
And this was kind of an after thought, but what if we've all been through those experiences where time seems to slow down, time seems to span up? What if it actually is slowing down and speed up, and that perception of time is our higher senses detecting when the line is going up or down? Because that could be very real. Because we know we can show that time is malleable, that it does move back and forward a little bit, our ability to move that. And we have, and I have this on the poster here under the Flatlanders and Overlords, and that's perspective. And let's go back a little bit to the M theory thing. We talked about multiple dimensions. They're doing the math, and they're like, it looks like there's multiple dimensions. There's more than 3. And then how many are there? Seemingly infinite. We don't know. You know, chaos. It's only chaos and infinite until you understand it, right? So when I was explaining, it was literally on the, I think I've got it even the podcast of this somewhere. I was trying to explain to somebody, it's just a ridiculous infinite. I was like, I can come up with a better idea. Here, how does this sound? And I came up with the pizza sphere. And that's up there. The second poster at the lower hand gets into this. And that is, we know that a Planck length is a Planck. The size of a particle of light, let's call it an element of light, is so small, it is, the Planck length, a particle of light, is to a dot on a piece of paper what that dot is to the entire known universe. It's that small.
Oh, wow.
Really big.
It's very, yes. And so it's the smallest unit of measurement. There's nothing smaller than that. Anything else can be divided by a Planck. Nothing, a Planck cannot be divided. So does anybody know about Zeno's paradox? Anybody ever run across that? Zeno's paradox? Could you?
Yeah, I think I can do it. So let's see, it's Achilles and a turtle, maybe possibly, and let's see if I can do this. The fast runner. Let's see. I have to think this out. The fast runner runs a certain distance, and in that time, the turtle travels a distance, and then the runner. Let's see. It's dividing things half and
half and half.
And
it was saying that it was a paradox in time, because if you follow this particular set of rules, then Achilles could never reach the turtle.
Right, the turtle always
right.
wins. I think you give the turtle a head start.
Right.
I think that's the way.
And another way it's expressed as, imagine you're trying to get to there from here, but the rule is you can only take a half step at a time. How long would it take you to get there? And then the idea is that you would never get there because you could always cut it in half. You could always cut it. Because they were exploring the idea of what? The subatomic world, infinity. At this time, 500 BC, I think it was, the concept of zero was just coming into play. The concept of infinity was just trying to work its way into mathematics. And so these were all ideas that were brand new. And so when you tied the multiple dimensions and infinity together, it'd be like, well, there's just an infinite number of dimensions. And so I like to think about it like this. Imagine you have a pizza, and you have a Planck cutter. So you have something that's a Planck length that can cut something a Planck length. But what you do is you cut it into 10 equal slices, okay? So you've got 10 slices, 10 dimensions of a larger piece that are seemingly identical. But if you look at each one, are they the same? They're a little bit different, right? There's something different about them all. So there you have 10 dimensions of a whole. So take that same concept and then start slicing it into Planck lengths in half. How long can you slice it? You could do the math. It would seem like a lot, but eventually you would get down to you got a slice that's a Planck length, you got another one right next to it that's a Planck length, and eventually you're going to be like, I can't do anymore because we've got it. If you were to try to number that, it would be 10 to the 33rd, I think at 32 digits, 10 to the 32nd power is how small it is. And that times 10 because you had 10 dimensions. So, I mean, like, if you were to look at that from the outside without that construct, it would seem there would be a huge number there.
So is a quark bigger than a Planck?
If I recall, yes. It's different states. There's 6 types of quarks: up, down, strange, charm, spin. What's the other one? What's the last one? I can't remember. I haven't worked that into these. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily apply. But the Planck length is small, right? So that up there, that little made-up math there is my version of the solve for Zeno's paradox, and the idea of how we can wrap our head around a seemingly infinite number of dimensions. So take the same concept as the pizza sphere and apply it to a sphere. So you got a globe, okay? You got a globe, and you've got a center point in that globe. And instead of just one globe, what you do is you carve out 10 distinct cones that individually, just right here, let's just imagine this is the center, there's an imaginary sphere right here. Individually, you can visualize there's 10 seemingly identical cones that are part of the sphere, but they're all different. They're all different dimensions of this sphere. And if you wanted to continue to cut them using Planck lengths of light, how many would it be? A lot. Seemingly infinite. If you did the math long enough, you would find out it's not infinite. Right?
Because it's a finite amount.
Because there's a finite space. You'd have to define the space. And so if you take those two concepts of defining infinity by a Planck length, then we have solved the M-theory problem. There aren't seemingly number of multiple, depending on your space, whatever your center point is in space that you're measuring, you can measure 10 out. So like imagine this was the center point, and you would imagine around here, there would be elements of wood, book, paper within that, and up here there would be air, you know? So you would have 10 spatial dimensions of the same area. In this case, they would be very different, you know, because they would include the table. And, but that, you combine those together, and we look at reality a little bit different. If you look up to the Flatlanders and Overlords,
which one is that?
Fourth one from the left. Actually, I'm going to get up here because I'm going to read this. So imagine like this arm is this right here, and there was a bug crawling on it. You know, that whole bug's life would be this, their perspective. So what we perceive, we would call that a two-dimensional perspective, right? But to that ant or to that little thing, it's not. That's a three-dimensional. Right, that's their whole universe. That's theirs, right? And so we look at that, and then we would call that a two-dimensional reality. We live in a three-dimensional reality because that's what we identify. But if you look at, one of the phrases you might hear me say is abstract vector spaces. If you look at quantum physics, and the Alameda is an examination of abstract vector spaces, and that is, how many vectors can a point have? Almost infinite. Because you can draw a point from any direction, right? So that when we're looking at the measurement of this in these spheres and these space, we're looking at abstract vector spaces and all the influence that's coming in around it. But if you want to define a space, or laws or mathematics should be description of the physical universe. Physical, not just matter, but energy as well, space, right? What's going on in there. So, we have the concept here that the spatial dimensions, the multiple dimensions here, now this is both logical and it can be tested. I can math this out with a mathematician really easy. And it provides another explanation for the multiple universe theory. And then you combine that with this, and the concept that we have higher senses. We have our 5 basic senses, but then we have the higher senses of intuition. The thing I told you about, like with my mom, you know, that's happened. The guy who invented EEG, I'll remember his name in a minute, he had a similar experience, but it was with his sister, and he was across, he was almost killed in a military accident. His sister like calls him sends him a message, telegram, what's going on, what's going on? And he's like, why do you, she's like, I just had this horrible dream that something terrible happened to you. He's like, well, I had a near-death experience yesterday. And, you know, he's like, wow. And she was really shook up, you know, so he knew that there was something. So his concept was waves. He's like, the waves is brain waves. He was the first person to actually do brain implants measuring this stuff. Because he thought that he could measure the higher senses. And they had to occur in waves of some sort. And I'm going to read this. This is from Matt Williams of Universe Today. He's very well known. You can Google him. I completely ripped him off, this quote, in the sense that I don't have his permission, but his name's here. So Matt Williams, Universe Today. Dimensions are simply the different facets of what we perceive to be reality. We are immediately aware of the three dimensions around us on a daily basis, those that define length, width, depth of all objects in our universe, x, y, and z axes, respectively. Beyond these three visible dimensions, scientists believe that there are many more. In fact, the theoretical framework of superstring theory points that the universe exists in 10 different dimensions. These different aspects of what govern the universe, the fundamental forces of nature, and the elementary particles contained within. Right? So I came across this long after the fact of my theory of this, that I came up with it. Why is 10 a number? We live in a base 10 universe. It's just, that's the structure of the universe. You know, and the cool thing about this model, I think, that doesn't eliminate other models, because like if I was to say the distance between me and this window is 13, what would that mean? No idea. 13 what? Is it centimeters? Is it inches? Feet? So you have to put that into context, right? There are other ways to look at this and modeling the universe with a different perspective, that what doesn't necessarily, to accept this doesn't mean to eliminate all others, complementary theories. But the way I express this, a couple of different ways. So imagine our conscious self, head, and just imagine ourselves as a pyramid or a cone, you know, with our energy coming out. And our consciousness is sort of summarized in all of our energy. Time surrounds us. We are time, in essence. And then we have the 10 dimensions. And then looking from the side, I like to contextualize this as the conscious, that's the head, the subconscious, the heart, and the unconscious, the whole self, the alternative self. And this is funny. Now at these conferences, I talk to PhD physicists from Stanford, MIT, left and right, coming all the time. And one of the things I thought was funny was they will talk about, oh, there's definitely a multiverse. There's another you out there. There's another world out there that we don't even completely understand. And then I say, well, we have a conscious, a subconscious, and an unconscious self. You know, at any one time, how many people are asleep in the world right now? Billions, right? How many of those are in REM sleep? Probably billions too, or a big number. So that in itself is a whole different level of reality. Our subconscious processing, how many people are awake right now, where their subconscious is active? That's a whole nother level. And then you do a concept of dreams, you know, talk to them about dreams. So some scientists will actually, I've heard people say dreams aren't real, but the multiverse is. I do look at our conscious self like this, and that we do enter those other realms. We can travel through time and space, through our subconscious and our unconscious self, and even conscious through what a lot of people just refer to as astral projection. There's lots of research on that. And so, but all of this would be combined into all of those senses, the higher senses, working within this type of field, right? We've got our own 10-dimensional, we are our own 10-dimensional field, and then we combine on Earth to create one as well. Now I put this in as a, this is the number for Planck length, by the way, as on how this sphere that we have potentially grows out around us. And I just used the Fibonacci, seems to be a very common repetitive in natural sequence that we see. Yeah, yeah. And so this would be used when we actually sit down and math everything out. Yep.
What are your 5 higher senses that you have listed there?
Oh, now these were just kind of, these are just my ideas for them. They're not necessarily a specific thing, but intuition, instinct, entanglement, imagination, compassion. Those are just five. That's not saying those are the only five. There's like, you could put dozens. I think I saw an AI program that had 72 emotions identified. Yeah. And so I was putting this as 5 basic senses, 5 higher senses. You could probably put all experiences under those 5 in some way. And really, we're experiencing them all at the same time. Okay, so that kind of covers this. For the, one of the ways I like to explain the functions of the mind lamp, those lamps, is imagine, so there's 8 colors, right? So imagine there's 8 lanes in a freeway. Or not a freeway, a toll booth, right? You know how cars kind of pile up? So this thing is shooting out these random bits, right? And there's 8 different channels that it can go through. And so as one of the channels gets filled up, it gets brighter. And then that's how it moves. But it's not so much as, it's really opening a gateway to nature through technology rather than programming it to do something. Because they didn't actually set out to program it specifically that way. It was kind of a discovery that, hey, this works when we do this.
Have you ever photographed it and then played it back real fast?
It's time lapse. Yeah, I've tried a little time lapse.
I mean, I would think you would see some sort of pattern.
All the time, all the time. And 2 of the biggest experiments I did were, one was this Science and Non-Duality conference. They had an outdoor performance, very dramatic, bolero, lots of like hats and gowns. It was really spectacular, right? Dramatic love story. And right at the apex, right at the crescendo of the performance, we look over at that, and like we got 9 purples. Wow. You know, it's like, whoa, look at that. And it was right at the performance top. And that was valid. That was like, cool, that's what we were hoping for, you know? And it's nothing that we could actually, you can't make it do it. Yeah, right. There's no, if you look in the back, there's no buttons to change the color. There's nothing. And then another experiment we did was at an art show called, it was on biohacking. And during the end, there was like a performance art thing where everybody in the entire space was all focused on one thing, and it was a installation performance art around bioengineering. And then at the end, they started playing a song, and the entire place started dancing together in a circle, right? And we looked over, and they were like 7 or 8, all the same color, and they stayed the entire time the dance was going on. That was pretty spectacular. And at the end of World's Fair Nano, actually, we got a data spike and a color field maximum right at the end of the show. So it does, and that's one of the reasons why I do these at real-world events. I want to say, is the technology at a place now where it's noticeable? And I can tell you, we'll probably experience it a little bit, but you put this in a dark room when it's the only source of light, and it is hypnotic. I've like had this in people's homes, sitting around. Pretty soon it's like everybody's, and there's no cannabis involved. It's just like, it looks like everybody's high because they're just staring at it and like, wow, look at that. Because it's not a dynamic, it's like not in your face, but when you sit down around it, the color field, you can certainly see like when they actually happen. And then what's more important than seeing it, you can begin to feel it. You feel the color change. And that is because it's happening synaptically. It's not your eyes that you're feeling change. It's happening synaptically. So, so the overarching concept that I came out, if you wanted to contextualize the unified theory into one phrase, it would be this.
What is that?
Excuse me. They usually come in 5s. So these are some of the theories we'll be talking about with this, and that is Spatial distortion, molecule displacement, and commingling. Okay? We can see what commingling here is when I'm using fluids because it happens with fluids. Two fluids come together, mixing. That mixing process is actually happening at this molecular level, and that's combining elements, is commingling them. Spatial distortion, we talked about that earlier with planets, how planets, the gravity force around a planet or any object will distort the space around it. Just like if my fist is here, putting my fist there just distorted all the space in there and the space around it. Okay? Pardon me? Right, yeah, you affect everything. One thing is connected to the next. And so ethospheric anthromemoration, we were talking about particles accelerators earlier. There's experiments where, entanglement experiments. You take two particles, bring them together, separate them by vast distances, impart a spin on one, the other one spins. Like they're what? Entangled, right? So part of what I started out with was like, okay, well, does that work with people? People come together and then they're separated. And this phenomenon, and they're entangled. Probably everybody here has been entangled with somebody, coworker, friend, relative, and you've gone to, maybe you haven't talked to them in a while, and you're going to text them or send them a message, and then boom, they call you right out of the blue, right? And what do? Oh, that's weird, right? And if you talk to somebody, like a science person generally, they'll be like, oh, that's just coincidence. You're not remembering all the other times when you didn't think about somebody and nothing happened. Coincidence is not a scientific theory. It's an excuse for saying, I don't know. You know, I call it a coincidence. There's a coincidence that needs to be explained. There's an explanation for everything. If this happened to some people once in a while, it could be explained away. But this happens to most people on a regular basis, and it's been happening since the invention of the telephone. They noticed this 100 years ago, right? And now we understand, and we can actually develop technologies around this. So this actually explains exactly why that happens. And ethospheric, I call, the ether has been an examination for hundreds of years. I say that if we're the mass, the combined energy of all of our mass is the ethosphere. It's the collective consciousness. That's what I call the ethosphere. And anthromemoration, murmuration is the phenomenon you see with birds and fish swarming, right? Birds and fish swarming. And a long time ago, early scientists were saying that, oh, that was all vision related. It's like, well, nobody's that responsive, right? That was debunked a long time ago. And I noticed that people do this too, right? Particularly, it's very observable on freeways with driving. But phase, what's that? Swarming on freeways, absolutely. Hey, sometimes I'm driving and I just like, I can't imagine why there aren't more accidents. How many near misses I have on a daily basis is amazing, you know. And I actually spoke with I don't know if anything will come with it, but I happened to meet the director of innovation at Jaguar, and I told her, we were having this conversation. I said, how many Jags are on the road at any one time? You know, they're all entangled. They all bought into the same brand. You know, if you put this in the cars, you can do some amazing stuff. So anyway. So what is entanglement? So like if people come together and they're entangled, how does it actually work? Just like magnets. So when we're talking about this, think of your heart, which it is. It's a magnet. It's an electromagnetic generator. As blood flows through it, it creates electrical flow. This is why your health is so important, the health of your blood. As a heart constricts, all that stuff. There's a ton of evidence on heart math. Heart math is a great resource for this. But your heart and your head are connected by synaptic pathways from your brain to your heart. And I think this is why. So go back to the birds, the murmuration. Why does that? That's an instinct. That is a survival instinct. If they didn't have that, they would be all alone. And a little tiny bird alone is helpless, right? It's going to be, but in mass, they can act as one, right? And people have the same way. This is how we were bonded as groups, as families, all kinds of stuff, friends. But have you ever met somebody that you just liked instantaneously? We just got along fabulously? Sure, we all meet those. We also meet people that, the other way, you know, I didn't like them at all. Why? I don't know. Didn't like their energy. And sometimes I've had relationships where we met and there was just fury, and then that brought us together, you know. And that process was the commingling of our energy, of our coming together. Because there's a lot, I would say most communication is unspoken, right? But how does it actually work? So we have if you were to measure, I got to get the exact numbers memorized, but your heart is much more powerful than your head. This is electrochemical, this is electro, mostly. So you could say like this is electro, this is chemical, they work together. You could probably, you know, light one of these lights with your brain power for a couple of seconds, you know, throughout a day, maybe. But your heart is very strong. And even with conventional electromagnetic detections, they can detect a person just being in the same, like 12, 15 feet away, right? But how long has your heart been beating? Since before you were born. Your heart has been beating millions of times a year your entire lives. And through that, we create a resonance that we're connected to. Our family, we're in phase. Think about it as phase. You're in sync with certain types of people that you come in contact with, whether they're strangers or not. You know, it all depends on what brought you together. So there's that frequency that this kind of represents eyesight, what happens when you look at each other. But this illustrates the idea of coherence. When they're in phase, when you meet somebody and your energies are in phase, so I'd like to think like right now, we're for the most part all in phase. Right? Our energies are coming together in a positive manner, which means that they are creating a sum energy that is greater than the individual parts. And when you're out of phase, there's just conflict. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. You're just out of phase. You're not in the same realm. If you're looking at green, somebody else is blue. You've got the Warriors. They've got whoever else they're playing. You know, they're not in phase. Right? But when you can bring a group of people together to do the same thing, so let's just say we had 6, 7 pairs of these glasses and we all sat down and did a guided meditation all at the same time, we would all be technologically infused with the same phase. We would be going in phase no matter what. You know, and then there's the conscious thing. If we were oming, that could help. Doing other exercises, there's lots of different things. But when you see groups of people coming to meditate together, that's what we see here, coming into phase.
You can feel it.
You can feel it. Definitely you can feel it. And then this just, your entanglement factor goes up with the emotion, physicality. You know, how physically are you engaged? For example, you take 5 people who play basketball together versus 5 people who play chess together. Different engagements, different levels of engagement, right? I'm not saying one's better than the other, just they're different. So, our heart is...
But the results you can produce when you're coherent is dramatically different than when you're not.
Definitely. Definitely. You can feel it. You can feel it in the room. And
That's the whole thing about the Warriors, is they are coherent.
Yeah.
They're a team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really a team.
And the only one in the whole NBA that's like that, and people haven't caught on to all of this yet.
And happens, great companies, great teams of all levels. It's because of this. They're in phase. And when you're in phase with somebody, it's not just about the words you speak, it's all the unspoken stuff, the intuitive nature that you get from being around those people.
You don't have to speak.
You don't have to speak. Sometimes you just know, right? So how it works is every time your heart beats, what it does is it encapsulates, encodes, and basically captures. One of the things I did in the Navy, I was a surface warfare specialist. So I was certified, I finished this on my first ship. I think I was 20 years old when I got it. It was certified to operate, basic understanding of every single system on the ship. And weapons, navigation, engineering, we had, my first ship had a lot of, we mapped the ocean floor and did submarine, anti-submarine warfare. And then special ops. We had a helo deck. And then we had this thing called the S.C.R.E.A.M, and it was a 300-foot sonar tube, basically, that would trail behind the ship, and we would ping out sonar. We'd map the ocean floor, and we'd hunt for submarines. And so I learned about signal propagation and the concept of carrier waves. So I like to think of this as we have a signal wave and a carrier wave. Our heart beats, that's the strength of it, right? And every time our heart beats, since before we were born, I like to say, like, your first breath, you and your mother had the same ethersphere until your first breath. Your first breath is really when you became your own entity, and you started sending out your own signal. So we've got our own torus, right? Our own heartbeat. And how far does it propagate? The entire Earth. You know, as soon as you come out of the womb, your heart's beating. You just got a little beat, right? It's just right here. But that beats out, and then the next time it beats, it moves a little further. Next time it beats, it moves a little further, and so on. How many times? Millions and millions of times, until it reaches around the whole Earth. And so this is why somebody that we're entangled to on the other side of the world, the moment we hit that, how fast is it traveling? For the most part, instantaneous. If we're talking about, you're talking about a field that you're connected to that's already throbbing, beating continuously, right? So when you think about something, you don't have to consciously, it's going to go out everywhere. And then you throw in the concept of intention. And that is, you're specifically thinking about, I do this stuff with some friends of mine. I was like, I want them to call me. I want them to call me. See if I can get them to call me. You know, there's all kinds of stuff you can do like that. But if imagine, like, that's why when your heart beats and you're sending it out, when you're thinking about something, let's just say this other person's in another state. Who thought of who first? You know, whichever one, it could have been a third party. Maybe mom was thinking of both of them at the same time, and all of a sudden something lights up. But what happens is, like, when you got billions of neurons firing, you know, every millisecond, and so the moment your heart beats, it captures that particular signal, and it's going to send it out everywhere. That other person, if they're in a state of awareness, they're going to get let's just call it a tingling sensation for your signature resonance. That's what's going to key up, because whatever you're sending out, your entire resonance is part of that, right? And so if you're thinking about a particular person, they're going to be able to pick that up just through signal propagation. So what a lot of people call psychic energy and stuff, and this is why some of the I understand the word psychic. I stay away from the word psychic because it has so many negative connotations, and people misuse that as well, right? But what we're really talking about is communication at a distance. You know, I'm not talking about bending spoons or any of that stuff. Just communication, how we communicate with each other non-verbally at a distance. How mom knows you're in trouble. You know, how your boss knows something's not right. Or the opposite. It can be all really good stuff as well. You know.
That's what prayer circles and stuff are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When we do the prayer thing in there and you put the box in the center, I'm thinking, and I just got to say, like, I see the world differently than most people, because when I look at all of you, I see your physical selves, but I imagine all the signal propagation that's going on around you. And I imagine all this stuff that I think that's working, I just see it. You know, not physically see it, but I mean, I just imagine that's what's happening. Look at the light now. Look at that. See? That is a really good gradation. Not complete. I've only seen a complete rainbow like twice, where it was just all the way around. So we've got this that goes out around the entire Earth, and I'm going to come back over here. Oh, wait a minute. There was Oh, here's in Tesla. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. These are your time travel. These are your multiple dimensions, stuff that cannot be tested, right? This is a testable theory. When we say theory, that's mostly misused, I think, by the general public. People think theory is a guess. They use the word theory as a guess. The theory is a series of steps and hypotheses based on an overarching concept. And so what we have here is a theory summarized in anthromemoration on how we connect, with the data points being decades and decades of research from the P.e.a.c.e labs and myself. I've conducted over 400 experiments that I've logged, and dozens of them have been at public events, seeing this stuff over and over and over again. And the reason, the moment I came up with the heartbeat component, I was in my space, I had the thing going, I was sitting alone, can't remember exactly what was going on, but I was trying to solve a problem, and we've all had those aha moments, right, where you solve the problem. It's like, God, that happened to me, and I was looking at the computer, boom, like 13 zeros in a row. It was just like right off it, just one huge thing, and it happened to just like the instant I had that moment. So I saw my idea manifest in data just like that. And I was like, oh, how did that happen? It had to be, because I could feel my heart. I was like, had to have been the heart. That's got to be, because it can't be brainwaves. See, that's where a lot of the people within this thing, they're thinking the consciousness is happening up here. It's not. It's happening here, and we are incomplete. I mean, you look at this. Where do ideas come from? Where do where are memories stored? Not up here.
How does this relate to perceptual awareness? I mean, if we have multiple senses, aside from our normal senses, are you driving towards looking at perception on these other, how these other levels apply to your awareness of frequency, for lack of a better term?
Perception? You mean feelings or?
Well, perception. You might be perceiving, you could have perceptive intuition.
Sure, sure. Intuition. I like to use the word intuition.
But I mean, you're looking for other senses.
Yeah.
Not accepted senses, the basic senses.
Let's call them soft or higher senses.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how are you applying the higher senses, or at least the practice or use thereof, to identify?
Yes, this would be just where, so imagine you've got millions of heartbeats going on around, and then just like the same concept of, we see this in forests, there's a forest fire, right? Animals clear on the other side of the forest who have no reason to know that that's happening, know there's a fire. Why? Because the heartbeats of the animals that were there were sending off signals, danger, danger, danger.